If you look for videos online about the new historicism, this episode's subject, if you look for videos like that, they will often make pronouncements about how historical research is done, or how history is understood.
New Historicism also believes that an objective view of history is impossible, because every event is some kind of product of the time and culture during its occurrence. We as readers and observers must interpret everything subjectively.
The objectivity of history is a myth. While the traditional historians have tried to force this point on us that history is something that is factual and real and written from an objective point of view,
But in new historical, history is textual. History is literature. It's not fact, it's fiction. And history and literature are interconnected.
One is that history is not linearly progressive and not reducible to the activities of prominent individuals. So the idea that history is progressive was born around the time of the scientific revolution, and the idea that society is evolving, becoming better and better throughout history and advancing towards a utopian or glorious future.
But when you are watching these videos, it is very hard to shake the feeling that when they use the word history, they are not in fact talking about historical study at all. And if you get that feeling, you are basically right. The word historicism in New Historicism does not refer to historical research. New Historicism is a type of literary criticism. And to be fair, most videos get this, and they talk about it as such. And even some of those I have just played are really examples of careless language rather than deliberate conflation. But historicism is a slippery word that has been used in a lot of ways, and to understand new historicism's tenuous relationship to history, it is necessary to delve deep into its development and the movements it was reacting against. The German word Historismus was coined in the early 19th century by Friedrich Schlegel, who worked primarily on the study of literature. It has since been widely applied, including as the English word historicism, often idiosyncratically to a whole bunch of things. There are architectural styles referred to as historicist, German historians in the 20th century who made a strong and basically unsound claim to scientific knowledge used it to describe themselves. Historiographers often use it to describe 19th century historians associated in particular with Leopold von Ranke. And there is a primarily philosophical movement in the early 20th century called the Crisis of Historicism. Eggers is always good for this sort of thing, and penned an article some time ago unwrapping many of these different uses. But none of these have anything to do with new historicism. The first thing to understand is there was never an old historicism. New historicism is not responding to any of the movements that call themselves or are called historicist. It is claiming a particular type of relationship to a practice called historical criticism, and we'll come back to why it uses the term new in a moment. What is historical criticism? It is the default mode of critical analysis for a work of art. You look at a work of art, in the case of the new historicism, a literary text, and you want to know more about it. So you ask, who made it? Where did they make it? When did they make it? That is historical criticism. And just to be clear, I don't mean that this seems like an obvious approach in a post-Enlightenment European intellectual tradition. Lots of approaches are only obvious in a specific cultural context, but this is not one of those. I could, for example, point to the Nikat al-Shuara, published in 1752, which harshly critiques 103 Persian poets, in part through biographies of those poets, an example of the well-established Persian genre of criticism known as tazkira. Historical criticism is a way of approaching art people naturally default to. And when academia professionalised in the 19th century, literary studies used a lot of historical criticism. not as a deliberate, self-reflective theoretical position, but as an obvious, intuitive way of examining the objects they were interested in. Of course, as any academic field develops, what seems obvious or common sense is often subject to harsh reflection. And rightly, common sense is just a way of saying you do not understand your own theoretical position. And in literary studies, the harshest and most lasting rebuke of historical criticism came in the mid-20th century. This critique was particularly associated with a movement called the New Criticism. There were a lot of issues at stake, more important to the participants than to us, but there are two main strands worth discussing, which I will illustrate through three relatively short articles. The first strand was a desire to assert the literary work as a cohesive and distinctive subject of analysis. After all, you tend to experience a piece of literature as a whole, not as a fragmented set of historical influences. Wimsatt and Beardsley's The Intentional Fallacy in 1946 and Barth's Le Mort de l'auteur in 1967, though very different in style, make similar arguments that the work, not the author, is what is important. Wimsatt and Beardsley write, "One must ask how a critic expects to get an answer to the question about intention. How is he to find out what the poet tried to do? If the poet succeeded in doing it, then the poem itself shows what he was trying to do." Barthes is more florid in his attack on the tyrannical nature of historical criticism. He writes, "To give an author to a text is to impose upon that text a stop clause, to furnish it with the final signification, to close the writing. This conception perfectly suits criticism, which can then take as its major task the discovery of the author, or is hypostasis, society, history, psyche, freedom. Once the author is discovered, the text is explained. The critic has conquered." These are positive responses, seeking to encourage a focus on the text itself. The second strand, apparent in Ransom's 1937 essay, Criticism Inc., exhibits a frustration with historical criticism. While Ransom accepts the author and the historical context are important, he sees most literary history as a dull, plodding, pedantic exercise that does more harm than good. In the conclusion of his essay, he writes, "There is hardly a critical problem which does not require some arduous exercise in fact-finding. But each problem is quite specific about the kind of facts it wants. Mountains of facts may have been found already, but often they've been found for no purpose at all, except piling up into a big exhibit to offer intoxicating delights to the academic population." By the 1970s, American literary studies had experienced 3 decades of fairly concerted attacks by influential writers on the utility and centrality of historical criticism as a method. It hadn't, judging by output, stopped anyone from doing historical criticism, but it presumably made them uncomfortable, or at least irritable, and unsurprisingly, we see a backlash. Academic literary historians writing defences of the practice of historical criticism, and in that process, the appearance of the term New Historicism, to describe a practice shorn of the perceived faults highlighted by the New Criticism, and, of course, borrowing the new from that very critical response. It first appears in the 1950s and builds slowly, but today the term is often associated with the Shakespearean scholar Stephen Greenblatt and the study of English Renaissance literature. Greenblatt is often inaccurately credited with inventing the term in the early 1980s, but as we can see, that is clearly not the case. Regular viewers will, I'm sure, be used to this sort of bar chart, tracking a term on the humanities-centered database JSTOR. This one gets a bit complicated because I'm not sure how often New Historicism is used in a context only tangentially related to literary criticism. For example, the article by Iggers on historicism I talked about at the start appears because he specifically says that he won't really be talking about New Historicism very much. But there are some important elements to draw out. The first, if we drill down, is how dramatic a shift we see around 1987. Sometime after the term was first used, and even sometime after it achieved relatively wide currency in literary studies. After 1987, we see a lot of people talking about the new historicism, and we get a lot of effectively retrospective volumes. And the shift is apparent in citations of Greenblatt's work. His retrospective discussions of what he was doing are apparently far more widely read than what he actually did. Which is weird. I can't think of another example in the humanities of something working like this. The normal way people learn about a movement is to read papers that either come early in that movement, as for example Criticism Inc., or are particularly strong statements and or influential, like Death of the Author. That is the way I just introduced New Criticism, and it is how I remember almost every historical debate I've ever been taught about being introduced to me. Learning about something largely through after-the-fact retrospectives is odd, but it is how people appear to learn about the new historicism. There is probably an interesting intellectual history to be written around the sudden success of new historicism. You see, new historicism is a very specific tool. It's not concerned with literature in general, but mostly with the English Renaissance literature, and often in practice that means the plays of Shakespeare. There are plenty of Shakespearean scholars, but nothing like enough to explain that sudden explosion in 1987. For that to happen, the term had to be adopted by people in other parts of the humanities. Philosophers, historians, cultural theorists, post-colonial scholars, so on. And the vehicle for that was something called the linguistic turn. The linguistic turn is used to denote a moment in the philosophy of history, the moment when they became interested in how historical writing operated as writing, how it was filtered through language, and going all the way back to works like Hayden White's meta-history in the 1960s. They borrowed heavily from literary theory as well as philosophy. Why they suddenly noticed new historicism around 1987, I have no idea, but they did, and they plucked it from relative obscurity in its small bubble of Shakespearean studies and provided it a new platform in the field of historical theory. It should be clear that though the word historicism invokes the idea of history, new historicism is completely detached from the reality of historical study. Based as it is on retrospectives about a movement which was responding to a caricature of a pre-war form of literary studies, not only is it 4 steps removed from anything actually to do with historical study, but the historical study it does have a tenuous relationship with belongs to the 19th century. It is very hard to evaluate a lot of the postmodern and post-colonial discussions of new historicism. How loosely is the term history being used? In a lot of YouTube videos, people do recognise this as a literary theory, but it's equally true that some are sloppy in their use of the word history, and some seem to take new historicism claims seriously as a critique of how historians operate. And that is undoubtedly partly a function of its adoption into postmodernism and post-colonial discussions in the late 1980s. Which raises the question of how ironic these references are. There is room for irony in any post-colonial use of new historicism. New historicism argues for a complex relationship, a dialogue between the text that is being studied and the historical context, and for the reading of more than just literature. Literature, it argues, shapes as well as responds to its historical context, and different audiences could experience it differently. There is never a stop clause in our analysis of it. For flavour, here is a passage by Greenblatt on the play Macbeth. Shakespeare constructed Macbeth around, or perhaps as, a piece of flattery. The flattery is not direct and personal, the fulsome praise characteristic of many other royal entertainments in the period, but indirect and dynastic. That is, James is honoured not for his wisdom or learning or statecraft, but for his place in a line of legitimate descent that leads all the way from his noble ancestor in the distant past. In order to enhance this point, Shakespeare had to twist the historical record. From Raphael Holinshed's chronicle, he would have found that Banquo figures as one of the murderous Macbeth's chief allies, not as his moral alternative. Shakespeare's Banquo, by contrast, is a figure of probity and decency. When Macbeth cautiously asks for assistance without specifying what action he has in mind, the upright Thane delicately but firmly declares his allegiance to the reigning king. Shakespeare transforms James' ancestor from a collaborator to a resistor. It must have been agreeable to James, whose immediate past was a sickening tangle of conspiracy and betrayal, to be told that his line was founded on a rock of rectitude. That passage illustrates the interplay between the artistic work, non-literary texts, audience and historical context. But interesting as that is, we are still dealing with a very conservative position. This is a passage about Shakespeare by a scholar dedicated to the defence of that playwright's individual genius. Not only is the new historicism defending the status quo, historical criticism, in literary studies against a theoretical attack, but it's using that defence to advocate for the individual genius of the dead white men who make up the traditional European literary canon. That is literally the opposite of what post-colonial studies is supposed to be about. Post-colonial studies should really be getting us to the question of whether Shakespeare is any more worthy of attention than his Indian contemporary Tulsidas, or, more radically, if either of them is as interesting as Chandravarti. If you don't know, Chandravarti is a female poet writing in roughly this period in Bengal. And there is no question in those YouTube videos that alongside videos produced for literary criticism, there are a surprising number of videos presenting new historicism in the context of post-colonial studies, without, that I can see, any irony in using a defence of European achievements as a critique of them. Don't get me wrong, I can see the potential value in new historicism for historians. The division between disciplines is fuzzy. There are a lot of times when a historian needs to use a literary text as a source, and any set of tools that helps you understand that text are useful. Though, as a final thought, it is worth saying that while I've read a fair bit about new historicism, I've never been very satisfied with my reading, which is why you've been directed to some readings on the new criticism in this episode, but you're not actually getting a reading suggestion for new historicism. I've never seen an application that seemed genuinely radical. I've never seen a description that offered a concise sense of what its contribution is. So I've always been left with the sense that new historicism is potentially interesting, though frequently misunderstood, but I've never quite known what to do with it. If you know of an example that you think is particularly good, then feel free to mention it in the comments. Should I get something that really changes my feelings on this, I will definitely do a follow-up episode. So thank you for listening.